Footsteps, a door creaks open. Do you want to see where he died? That's when an 11-year-old girl said, before leading police to a body no one had found yet. And the worst part? She had already done it before. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where we uncover real crime stories. Stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Tonight's case is different, not just because of what happened, but because of who did it. Stay with me, because every moment of this story reveals something darker than the last. It all began in 1968, in the quiet streets of Newcastle upon Tyne. It was the kind of place where families felt safe, where children played freely outside, and where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. But that sense of safety didn't last. One afternoon, a young boy named Martin Brown disappeared. At first, no one panicked. Children wander, they lose track of time, and usually they come back. But Martin didn't. Hours later, his small body was found inside an abandoned building. The scene was strange. There were no obvious signs of violence, no struggle, nothing that clearly pointed to murder. Police believed it might have been an accident, something tragic but explainable. And just like that, the case began to fade into the background. But something about it didn't feel right, because in the days that followed, two young girls kept returning to that same building. They would stand nearby, watching, whispering, lingering longer than anyone else. One of them was 11-year-old Mary Bell. At first, no one thought much of it. Children are naturally curious. But this didn't feel like curiosity. There was something unsettling about the way she behaved, something that made people uncomfortable, even if they couldn't explain why. Then things took a strange turn. A few days after Martin's death, a note appeared. The handwriting was rough, uneven, clearly written by a child. But the message was chilling. We did murder so that we may come back. Most people dismissed it as a joke. Kids playing around, trying to scare others. Police didn't take it seriously, but they should have, because that note wasn't a joke. It was a warning. And just weeks later, that warning became reality. Another child disappeared. 3-year-old Brian, how had been playing near his home when he suddenly vanished. This time, the entire neighborhood reacted immediately. Search parties formed. People called his name through the streets, and fear began to spread. When his body was finally found, there was no confusion. This was murder. Unlike the first case, this one showed clear signs of violence. It was deliberate, intentional, and deeply disturbing. Whoever did this didn't panic or act by accident. They knew exactly what they were doing. And what made it even more chilling was that the killer had returned to the scene. This wasn't just someone trying to get away with a crime. This was someone who wanted control, someone who wanted to relive it. As fear tightened its grip on the community, police began searching for answers. They looked for strangers, outsiders, anyone suspicious. But the truth was much closer than anyone imagined, because one name kept coming up: Mary Bell. At first, it didn't make sense. She was just a child, 11 years old. The idea that she could be responsible felt impossible. But the more they watched her, the harder it became to ignore. She didn't react like the others. While families were grieving and the entire neighborhood was on edge, Mary seemed calm. Not just calm, but interested. She asked questions, very specific questions. The kind of questions that suggested she knew more than she should. She followed the investigation closely, paying attention to every detail. It was almost as if she wasn't trying to understand what happened, but trying to see how much others knew. Then something happened that changed everything. Mary began talking to other children about the murders. Not in a fearful way, but in a way that felt disturbingly confident. She described details that had never been released to the public. Details only the killer would know. That was the moment people started to truly question her. Not as a witness, not as a curious child, but as a suspect. Still, police hesitated. The idea was too shocking to accept. A child committing murder didn't fit their understanding of reality. But the evidence kept building. And then came the moment that removed all doubt. Mary led a group of children directly to the exact spot where Brian Howe's body had been found. Not just a general area, the exact location. She pointed it out as if she had been there before. As if she knew, because she had been there. At that point, Investigators could no longer ignore what was right in front of them. They weren't looking at a bystander. They weren't looking at a witness. They were looking at the killer. But even as the truth began to surface, one question remained. How does an 11-year-old become capable of something like this? To understand that, you have to look at her past, because behind the quiet face, behind the strange behavior, was a childhood filled with darkness. Mary Bell did not grow up in a normal home. Her early life was marked by neglect, instability, and alleged abuse. There are reports suggesting she was exposed to harmful environments at a very young age, experiences that no child should ever endure. This doesn't excuse what happened, but it begins to explain it. Because sometimes the making of a killer doesn't start with the crime. It starts long before. As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Mary wasn't just acting out. She wasn't just a troubled child. She showed signs of something far more serious. A lack of empathy, a fascination with harm, an unsettling calmness in situations where others felt fear. These weren't random traits. They were warning signs. And no one had recognized them in time. Eventually, Mary Bell was arrested. An 11-year-old girl taken into custody for murder. The entire country was shocked. People struggled to understand how something like this could happen, how a child could take the lives of other children. But as the trial began, the story became even more complicated. Experts examined her psychological state. They looked at her past, her behavior, her environment, and what they found painted a picture not just of a killer, but of a deeply damaged child. In the end, she was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. She was not considered fully accountable for her actions, but she was not innocent either. Mary was sentenced to detention and spent years in custody. Eventually, she was released and given a new identity, allowed to start a new life away from the public eye. But the story didn't end there, because the questions never went away. Was she born this way, or was she shaped by everything she had been through? And more importantly, could something like this happen again? 2 young boys lost their lives, and the person responsible was someone who never truly had a chance to be a child. If this story stayed with you, make sure you subscribe, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes, the most terrifying stories aren't about monsters hiding in the dark. They're about the ones we never expect. The ones who look just like everyone else. The ones who walk among us unnoticed until it's too late. And in this case, the monster was a child. The case should have ended there. An arrest, a trial, a sentence. But this story doesn't let go that easily. Because even after Mary Bell was taken into custody, something about her behavior continued to disturb everyone who came into contact with her. She didn't react the way people expected. There were no emotional breakdowns, and no visible remorse. Instead, there was calmness and, at times, something even more unsettling, detachment. Investigators and psychologists began spending more time with her, trying to understand what was going on inside the mind of an 11-year-old who had taken 2 lives. What they discovered raised even more questions than answers. Mary could switch emotions quickly. One moment she seemed like a normal child, the next completely cold. She spoke about the events in a way that felt distant, almost disconnected, as if she were describing something that happened to someone else. And then there were moments where she appeared to enjoy the attention. That detail alone sent chills through those working on the case, because it suggested something deeper than trauma. It suggested control. As the investigation continued behind closed doors, more details about her early life came out. Stories of neglect, instability, and possible abuse became harder to ignore. People began to see that Mary hadn't grown up in a safe or nurturing environment. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Not every child who experiences trauma becomes violent. So what made this case different? That question became the center of intense debate. Was this the result of her environment, or something she was born with? Experts couldn't fully agree. Some believe she showed early signs of psychopathy, traits like lack of empathy, manipulation, and emotional detachment. Others argued she was simply a product of everything that had gone wrong around her. And that debate continues even today. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a place of tension and disbelief. People struggled to reconcile the image of a young girl with the reality of crimes. Witnesses described her behavior. Experts presented their findings. And slowly, the full picture began to take shape. A child who had been failed in ways that were impossible to ignore. When the verdict was delivered, guilty of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility, it reflected that complexity. She was held accountable, but not entirely blamed. After sentencing, Mary was sent to a secure facility where she would spend the next several years. And during that time, something else began to happen. She started to change. Not overnight, not dramatically, but gradually. Reports suggested that as she grew older, she began to show signs of understanding, of reflection, of something that might resemble remorse. But even that was difficult to measure, because how do you truly know what someone is feeling, especially someone who has learned to hide it so well? Years passed, the public moved on, but her name, her story, never completely disappeared. Then, in 1980, after serving around 12 years, Mary was released. She was given a new identity, a chance to start over. Her location was kept secret, her past officially buried. But the reality was different, because stories like this don't stay hidden. They resurface, they follow, they linger. And even though she was no longer in custody, the shadow of what happened in 1968 never left. People questioned whether she should have been released at all. Others believed she deserved a second chance, especially considering her age at the time of the crimes. It became a conversation not just about one case, but about justice itself, about responsibility, about whether someone so young could ever truly be beyond redemption. And then something unexpected happened. Years later, it was revealed that Mary had built a life. She had a family, even a child of her own. That revelation shocked many people, because it forced them to confront an uncomfortable reality. The same person who had taken lives had gone on to create one, and that raised even more questions. Can someone like that truly change? Can they leave the past behind? Or does it always stay with them quietly beneath the surface? To this day, her exact whereabouts remain protected. Her identity remains hidden, and her story remains one of the most disturbing cases in true crime history, not because of the number of victims, but because of what it represents. A collision between innocence and violence, between childhood and something far darker, and at the center of it all, a question that still has no clear answer. Was she born this way, or was she created by everything that happened to her? As you think about that, I want to hear your perspective. Do you believe someone like Mary Bell can truly change? Or do you think some lines, once crossed, can never be undone? Let me know in the comments. And if you've stayed with this story until the end, make sure you subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who's interested in true crime. Because stories like this aren't just about what happened. They're about understanding why. And sometimes the why is far more terrifying than the crime itself, because it reminds us of something we don't like to admit. That darkness doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it grows from within.